Unit 14, social psychology, and our last unit, right? So we got, 7 lessons in this unit. It's going to bring us up to module 80, and then we will be done by, I think, Thursday next week. So social psychology, it's about the psychology of situations, right? Because to be social, there's got to be multiple people there. So we're going to talk about attribution, attitudes, and actions today, what those are, conformity and obedience, behavior in groups, prejudice and discrimination. We'll look at aggression, then attraction, and then we'll end with a nice lesson on altruism, conflict, and peacemaking. Okay, and then we will be done with all the material. So just a little breakdown of that. Okay, these are the same order, right? Here's today. You're watching this on Wednesday the 1st. We've got to pay rent tomorrow. Just remembered. Okay, so there's 3 lessons this week. Excuse me, 4 lessons next week. And I realized technically, I think Thursday, Friday next week is technically spring break. I'm going to post a lesson on Thursday since I'm not going to wait, a week and a half to do one lesson. So I'm going to post that. But then we'll be done. And the only thing you'll have to do, right, Friday is totally optional. It's a review. No new assignment. The assessment, though, is the only thing you'll have to do over the break. But you have plenty of time, right? It's not due till Sunday, the 19th of April. So you'll have 9 days to get it done, and it should only take you like an hour or 2 max. Okay, so let's jump right in. So attribution, attitudes, and actions. Nice alliteration there. So questions we want to consider are: what social psychologists study, right? How do we tend to explain others' behaviors compared to our own? And then we'll ask the question: does what we think affect what we do, or does what we do affect what we think? And you could probably guess it's both, right? What we think is, of course, going to affect what we do, and the things that we do, which the second one maybe not so obvious, right? The things that we do can actually affect the way we think. So the topics to look at today is social psychology. What is it? We'll talk about the fundamental attribution error, and then we'll talk about how actions and attitudes affect one another. All right, so social psychology, what do they study? Well, if we think back to Unit 10, we talked about personality, right? So personality psychologists, they study personal traits and dynamics, right? They aim to explain why different people may act differently in the same situation, right? Therefore, the difference is only between the people, and that would be a personality thing. Social psychologists focus on the situation itself. They explain why the same person will act differently in different situations, right? So same person, right? That's not the variable here. The variable is the situation in terms of social psychology. Okay. So fundamental attribution error. So before we get to that, right, attribution theory says that we can attribute a behavior, so somebody does something or you do something, and we can attribute it 2 different ways. We could say, oh, the person did that behavior because of their stable, enduring traits, right? That's who they are. It's part of their personality in a way, and that's why they acted that way. That's a dispositional attribution. Or we could say it's the situation that's causing the behavior, which is a situational attribution, okay? Now, the fundamental attribution error. This is a tendency for observers when they're looking at somebody else's behavior to underestimate the situation, the impact of the situation, and to overestimate the impact of their personal disposition. Okay, we're going to see this doesn't hold true for when you're talking about yourself. This is really for when you're looking at other people and you're looking at their behavior and you're trying to explain why they would do that. You're more likely to say, oh, that's just the way that person is. That's just their personality. That's part of them. Rather than, well, let's examine the situation that they're in and attributing the behavior to that, right? So the fundamental attribution error, right, we're more likely to attribute a dispositional, like a person's traits rather than the situation, to their behavior. So in one study, 1979, at Williams College, a bunch of students, right, they did an experiment where students would talk one at a time with a young woman who acted either very cold and critical or warm and friendly. Uh, so before the talks, researchers told half of the students that the women's behavior would be spontaneous. So they lied to them, saying that the woman would act however she wanted to. The other half, they told the truth. They said, well, no, she's going to act a certain way. We're going to tell her to be friendly or we're going to tell her to be unfriendly, and that's how it's going to be. Right? Straight up just telling them, right, and hiding nothing from the participants. Even the people that heard the truth, the students that were told this woman is going to act a certain way, we're going to tell her how to act, didn't affect the students' impression of the woman. They still attributed her behavior to her personal disposition, even when they were told directly that her behavior was situational. So just to reiterate that, right? I'm a participant in the study, and they tell me I'm part of the truth group, right? They're like, hey, you're going to talk to this woman, and we're going to tell her to act either friendly or unfriendly. Okay? Oh, sure. Then I go, I talk to the woman, and she said, let's pretend she acts unfriendly because she was told to do that. Later, I then, when they ask me about the woman, I'm going to say, well, no, she's unfriendly because that's kind of just who she is. I could tell that's just part of her personality. Even though I know for a fact that she was instructed to act unfriendly, so that's 100% situational, I still attribute, or in this case, these students still attributed her behavior to her personal disposition over the situational disposition, right? We're seeing the fundamental attribution error play out even when you know about it, right? So we're learning about the fundamental attribution error right now, and you're still probably, right, going to, when you see somebody behave a certain way, probably put too much on their personality and not enough on the situation. We see this more in individualistic cultures rather than collectivist. When we explain our own behavior, we're much more sensitive to the situation, right? We're much more willing to say, I acted that way because this, and this in the the situation. I don't do well in this scenario. The people around me. Earlier that day, I experienced something. Right? We're more likely to explain our own behavior in terms of the situation rather than our own personal disposition. Right? This would be the self-serving bias, if you recall. Right. The most likely time we're to commit the fundamental attribution error is when we're seeing a stranger, so someone we don't know at all, and they're acting badly. Right. So let's say you're on the subway and a stranger starts just like cursing up a storm and freaking out and just like throwing their stuff around, right? People are more likely to look at that person and say, wow, that person's crazy, or like, wow, that person is just like kind of a jerk. Um, right? Rather than think about the situation, right? Who knows what's going on in their life? Who knows where they just came from, right? So we're most likely to commit this error when a stranger, someone we don't know, is acting badly. This, right? Think about poverty and homelessness, right? Do you attribute it to social circumstances or personal disposition? This question reflects political views. We see that political conservatives tend to place the blame on the personal disposition of the poor and unemployed, right? They would say things like people get what they deserve. Those who don't work are freeloaders. Those who take initiative can still get ahead, right? So a political liberal, on the other side of it, and social scientists, so this is backed by social scientist research, they're more likely to blame past and present situations, right? They might say something like, if you or I had to live with the same poor education, lack of opportunity, and discrimination every day, would we be any better off? No, we'd probably be in the same situation as them. Okay, so we can see a split here that between in terms of politics, right? Point to remember here, right, are attributions either to a person's disposition or the situation have real consequences, because we see this error being made in politics, and politics ends up creating laws or changing people's attitudes, which we'll talk about in a second. Um, But it's very easy to make this fundamental attribution error, and it has real life consequences. All right, so attitudes and actions. Does what we think affect what we do, or does what we do affect what we think? So it's going to be both, like I said at the top here. So real quick, some definitions, right? Attitudes, these are feelings influenced by our beliefs, most often, that predispose our reactions to certain objects, people, or events. So attitudes, they do affect actions. Consider climate change. Almost all climate scientists agree that, yeah, there's a threat. Okay, global warming is real. Climate change is real. It's happening. It's man-made. Okay. Uh, Now, in 2006, 30% said that global warming was exaggerated. In 2010, and this is Americans of a poll, in 2010, so 4 years later, 48% said that it was exaggerated, which dropped a little bit to 42 in 2012. Okay, so because public attitudes affect public policies, right? Activists on both sides are trying to persuade the other to, join their side in this debate, and all other debates. So this persuasion effort usually takes two forms, right? Persuasion is all about changing attitude, which will then affect actions. Okay, so one way to change somebody's attitude is through the peripheral route persuasion. So it doesn't engage in systematic thinking, but it does produce fast results, and people respond to incidental cues, right, and make snap judgments. So you're watching TV, and one of your favorite actors denies climate change, right? You might be more likely to make the snap like, oh, they don't, I like them, so I'm not going to believe in climate change either. Okay, that's a peripheral route persuasion because there's no evidence there. It's a snap judgment, right? You're basing it off kind of like a whim in a way. This is what advertisements do, right? A perfume ad. We have beautiful, famous people that are in love in the advertisement, right? We automatically think, oh, that perfume, probably awesome because look at these people are beautiful and famous and in love. There's no evidence or anything there, right? But they're persuading you a peripheral route. It's almost like tricking you in a way. It could be by accident though. So the central route persuasion, this is where you offer evidence and arguments that aim to trigger favorable thoughts, right? Depending on how you're trying to persuade them. Right, this occurs when people are naturally analytical or they're involved in the issue already, right? And because it's more thoughtful and less superficial, if people are persuaded by central route persuasion, it's more likely to last, right? And it's more likely to influence their behavior. Okay, so somebody who's, if we think climate change, right? Somebody who is influenced by I don't know, somebody famous, right? They see one of their favorite famous people wherever deny climate change. They might be persuaded to also deny it, but it's not based on anything except like a snap judgment, so it might not last, right? And they probably won't act on it. Maybe they'll talk about it and deny climate change in front of other people, but they're probably not going to act on it. Whereas if you're persuaded by central route persuasion, right, you've been offered evidence and arguments, and now you have a foundation, right? It's more real, so you're more likely to act on it, and you're more likely to continue to have that attitude after long after the persuasion has happened. Remember, anyone that's trying to persuade anybody else are trying to influence behavior through the change in attitude, right? Trying to change your attitude about something so that you'll act in the way that they want you to if they're attempting to persuade you. Attitudes are especially likely to affect behavior when external influences are minimal, when the attitude is stable, specific to the behavior, and easily recalled, right? So, likely to affect behavior. So it's like, in this case, if we're talking about attitude towards climate change, we'll just stick with the same example. The behavior, if you're trying to get someone, right, maybe to do a protest or to, I don't know, stop using plastic or things like that, those behaviors are more likely to be influenced by that attitude because it's specific to the attitude that you hold. That's all that's really saying. So key point, right? Persuasion changes attitudes, which then changes your behavior. But actions also affect attitudes. Now, this is a little less intuitive, right? It makes sense that our attitudes will affect our actions, right? I believe a certain thing, so I'm going to act a certain way. But acting a certain way can cause you to believe a certain thing, believe it or not, right? So not only will people stand up for what they believe in, but they'll also believe more strongly in what they have stood up for. Okay, so it's a cycle, right? It's a two-way street here. And this kind of is exemplified by what's called the foot in the door phenomenon. All right, this is where people who have first agreed to a very small request are much more likely to comply with a larger request. Okay, so to get people to agree to something big, you start small and you build. Okay, so in one test here, one study, they asked a bunch of people if, hey, can we put this giant 10-foot drive carefully sign in your yard? Only 17% of people said, yeah, sure, okay, you can do that. However, if they first agreed to a very small sign, 3 inches, tiny, if they first agreed to that, then 76% of those people said, yeah, you can put the giant sign in my yard, right? It's because they agreed to that smaller thing first that they're more likely to agree to the larger ask later, right? You can use this, in your life. Think about allowance, right? Mom, can I have like $1 to do whatever? Like $1, sure, whatever. That's nothing. And then you slowly build it up, right? And all of a sudden, that $20, $50 doesn't seem like such a big ask coming from you. But if you start out at 50, hey, can I have $50? What? No way. That's so much money. You can't have that. You got to build up, right? Foot in the door phenomenon. After school desegregation in the United States, right, after the Civil Rights Act, 1964, white Americans expressed diminishing racial prejudice, right? This is the foot in the door phenomenon being used for good. So you get people, to accept school desegregation, and then you can make bigger asks, and then we see this diminishing racial prejudice. Okay, role playing. Right? If you pretend to be somebody, it can affect your attitude. So a role, you probably know this, you're in a theater arts school, right? It's a set of expectations or norms about a social position, defining how a person should behave, right? So taking on a role, you take on a certain attitude about the world and then behave accordingly. A classic example of this is the Stanford Prison experiment or Stanford Prison simulation. I'm pretty sure there's a whole Netflix documentary on this. Very interesting. I would check it out. It has real footage and stuff. But essentially, he Zimbardo here, and you could read this little blurb over here in the left corner. He basically took participants and broke them up into two groups. You're the guards, you're the prisoners, and just had them kind of act out doing that. And what happened is the guards started abusing the prisoners. And this is just these are college kids in an experiment. They know they're in an experiment. After not that long, a few days, that because they took these roles, the prison guards actually started tormenting the prisoners and being very cruel to them. And it didn't take that long. And we also see that in places like Abu Ghraib, right? Atrocities that were committed there. And this last quote down here in the bottom left sums it up pretty nicely. It's from Zimbardo, right? It says, when ordinary people are put in a novel, evil place, like prisons, right, situations win, people lose, right? If you're a guard in a prison, the situation, right, is very strong. It's going to make you act like, a terrible guard. You're going to be more likely to torment or torture the prisoners just by being in the situation. Whereas if that person was somewhere else, like in a supermarket, they would never do anything like that, right? Okay. So this leads to cognitive dissonance theory. So we act to reduce the discomfort, which is dissonance, we feel when two of our thoughts, cognitions, are inconsistent. So when we are aware that our attitudes and our actions don't match up, we can reduce it by changing our attitudes. So in that Stanford prison experiment, right, the prison guards, after acting in a certain way, right, are probably begin to adopt the attitude that this is how prisoners, or I mean, these prisoners deserve it, right? I'm the guard, they're the prisoners. This is how prison guards should act. They see other people doing the same thing, right? So they slowly change their attitude to match their actions, right? If I choose to do it or say it, then I must believe in it. That's kind of the quote unquote logic behind it. Um, so in one poll, I think they posed this question: would the war in Iraq be justified if they didn't have weapons of mass destruction? Before the war started, 38% of Americans said, yeah, it'd still be justified. After the war started, 58%, a majority, said they supported the war even if there were no weapons of mass destruction. The difference there, that 20% difference, nothing changed, right? It's because the action had already been taken, therefore attitudes were adjusting. That's cognitive dissonance theory, right? If you perform an action that your attitude doesn't agree with, you change your attitude, believe it or not, right? Not guaranteed, but that's what we see, right? That's cognitive dissonance theory. Hamlet says it right. Assume a virtue if you have it not, for use can almost change the stamp of nature, right? So if you don't have a certain virtue, pretend you do. And eventually your attitude will actually change, and you'll all of a sudden have that virtue, right? Right, cruel acts shape the self, but so do acts of goodwill. If you pretend to like somebody, you actually will end up probably liking them, right? So actions can affect our attitudes. Behaving a certain way, even if it's fake at first, even if it's 100% fake, will actually change the way you feel about the situation, right? Pretty interesting stuff. So, check for understanding, right? A couple questions here. I'll leave these up. You can go ahead and pause. We got 4 questions. Make sure you can answer these, right? If you can't, go back and just rewatch some of these or look over the PowerPoint slides that I posted. And then here are some FRQs, some simple ones, right? Explain the fundamental attribution error, and then please know the difference between peripheral and central root persuasion. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Pretty short one. I will see y'all tomorrow.